Hello, and welcome to another TMRN Time Monk Radio Network production. I'm Plain, and today is Saturday, the 22nd of September, 2012. Joining us today is preparedness expert James Wesley-Rawles. James is a former U.S. Army intelligence officer who now works as a full-time blogger, retreat consultant, and freelance writer. He has been an enthusiastic survivalist since his teenage years. Today, he will discuss some of the challenges we may face in the years ahead and ways to overcome them. His website is www.survivalblog.com. Hi, James. Welcome to a roundtable discussion with Time Monk Radio.
Thanks for having me on.
The Time Monk Radio administrator is Fox, and today he will be doing the recording and technical support of the show. Several members of the forum were kind enough to join us for this discussion. They include Lenny, Disaster Cat, and Romans. So, Jim, what inspired you to write your books? Could you discuss how Patriots became a bit of an underground bestseller?
Well, I wanted originally to write a survival manual, but I realized that most folks won't take the time to sit down and read a nonfiction book of any length. So I thought that what I could do was simply write a novel and put a lot of practical, tactical ideas, useful knowledge into the format of a novel so that people could have an enjoyable read, but then take away from that things that they could apply to their lives. I tried to squeeze a lot of practical tips into a fictional storyline, and it worked out fairly well.
And it became a bit of a bestseller there, right? I mean, how did it turn into an actual novel instead of something that was just passed around?
Well, it started out as shareware in the early days of the Internet. I wrote the first draft of the novel the winter of 1990, 1991, before most Americans had ever even heard of the Internet. And it went out as shareware in 1994. And it very quickly became the most popular shareware novel on the Internet. Again, the Internet was quite small at the time. But even then, I had 78,000 people download the novel, which by the standards of the time was basically a runaway bestseller. And it got so popular, in those days, servers weren't capable of handling much, so we had to create multiple mirror servers, and at one point we had the novel was mirrored on 18 different websites around the world to handle all the traffic.
And eventually you found a publisher? Or
we eventually a publisher noticed that it was being downloaded in great numbers, and they asked me if I wanted to do a paperback book of it. And that was a publisher now defunct called Huntington House out of Louisiana. And they very quickly got the book into production and created a decent-looking cover and put it out there, and it took off because there were so many people who had read the shorter shareware version. In the paperback version, I added a few chapters, and it took off. We had over 20,000 copies sold in paperback within the first year. And then it became a perennial good seller for Huntington House until they went out of business. And then about 1999, they went out of business, and the novel became unavailable. The old shareware versions of the novel, the shorter version, started circulating again, and then I realized I had to go ahead and get it back into print. So I had a self-published edition for a while. And then Ulysses Press out of Berkeley, California, picked the novel up. And they were actually not even a fiction publisher at all. They did primarily travel books. They were best known for the Hidden Hawaii book and all of its many sequels. But they saw the wisdom of getting it back into print, and it turned out to be their bestseller. And then since then, I've written a couple of sequels, as well as a nonfiction book for Penguin. And I'm in the process of writing 2 more sequels.
So how do the novels, the three novels, Patriots, Survivors, and Founders, how do they differ, and what are the similarities?
Well, they're all set in the same time period. Unlike most sequels, which usually push the same characters farther into the future, the approach that I took was to expand on the experiences of some of the characters in backstories, but primarily set the sequels in different locales, but contemporaneous to the first book. So Founders is set in this exact same time, near future time period as Patriots, but it's set primarily in New Mexico, whereas Patriots took place primarily in the inland Northwest, in and around Moscow, Idaho. And then the third book, Founders, takes place primarily in Kentucky and Tennessee, and there's also a subplot that takes place in western Montana at Malmstrom Air Force Base involving an Air Force NCO. And then it fills in the backstory from the first book of Ken and Terry Layton in their cross-country trek.
In Founders, what are some of the lessons a reader can learn from what happens? A couple go from Chicago to Idaho, mostly on foot.
Mm-hmm.
When reading their travails, it seemed to me that two bug-out locations would make sense, one in a much closer location.
Oh, certainly. Yeah, I actually wrote that whole sequence to illustrate what people shouldn't do. People shouldn't attempt to get out of Dodge at the 11th hour, because if you do, you may end up stuck in the world's largest linear parking lot and have to resort to traveling on foot or by bicycle, I suppose. So I basically included Ken and Terry Layton's story partially for drama and partially as a indication of what people shouldn't do. Ideally, someone should live at their retreat year-round like I do, but I realize that because of family circumstances and work circumstances that most people aren't in the position to do that. So if you do have a stocked rural retreat somewhere, I recommend that you keep a lot of vacation time on the books and be ready to get out of Dodge at the 11th hour. And don't hesitate. You need to have most of what you'll need there waiting for you, because you'll probably only have one trip out of Dodge. And if you're lucky, you'll be ahead of the Golden Horde, and you will make it to your retreat quickly. But if you hesitate, which is what I showed Ken and Terry Layton doing, you could end up with a very long trip on foot, depending on how far it is to your retreat. In their case, it was all the way from Chicago, Illinois, to northern Idaho, and it took them 2 years.
Should they have had a separate location in Wisconsin or somewhere?
Oh, sure. Ideally, they should have. And in fact, anyone who has a rural retreat should probably cache supplies at a number of locations along the way. If they have relatives or friends en route, you could ask to leave, a Foot Locker tucked away in their garage. Or if you don't have friends or relatives on your route, I've heard from a number of people that they've surreptitiously cached supplies in waterproof containers like military surplus ammo cans on national forest land. And they basically use the same technique that is used by geocachers. With geocaching, you find a location that is not on any trail, so it won't be seen, and then you hide a caching container and record its GPS coordinates and draw yourself a map of how to find it. Now, of course, with geocaching, they only partially conceal a container because the goal is actually for it to be found. That's in the geocaching sport. For someone who's seriously caching something that they don't want to have found by anybody but themselves, it should actually be completely underground, but it doesn't need a lot of soil over the top of it. In fact, you don't even need enough soil that it would even require anything more than a hand trowel to expose the top of the container to get it up out of the ground. Containers that work quite well are military surplus 20 millimeter ammo cans. Those measure about 10 inches wide by 20 inches tall by 22 inches long. And they have a watertight seal that's clamped down by two large locking levers. And they can hold quite a bit, and they make a really good container for a interim cache along your route to your retreat.
One thing with those two characters that stood out to me is, how quickly everything fell apart, and how would you know? The radio stations are working, the power's working, and then essentially within 24 hours, you're too late.
It's chaos, yeah. Well, and that very well could happen in urban areas. I think there'll be a little bit more of a delay in the suburbs, but people who do live in urban areas who are planning to bug out to a rural retreat have to keep a very close eye on the news. And you basically have to follow your gut instinct. If you think that, if you hear in the news that there's rioting starting to break out in any other cities, you've got to go with the assumption that there'll be rioting in your own city if it is of similar size, that they'll be rioting there in short order, and you need to get on the road immediately. That's why it's very important to have all your gear that you do plan to take with you prepackaged, literally numbered and lined up and ready to go, and you need to test fit all that gear in your vehicle and put it in containers that will fit properly into your vehicle. The last thing you want to do is spend hours agonizing over what you are going to take with you and what you're going to leave behind. That was the mistake that I showed Ken and Terry Layton, the fictional characters, making, and they ended up going too late. So it's important that you test fit your gear. It's incredibly important that you pre-position the vast majority of your gear at your intended retreat. Again, you may only have one trip out of Dodge, and you may even lose that vehicle in a worst case, and you may end up on foot. So unless you have the vast majority of your weapons, ammunition, food storage, gardening seed, tools, first aid, all the even minor surgery gear, all your references, all of that has to be at your retreat waiting for you. You can't plan on taking it with you at the 11th hour. Don't plan on towing a trailer, because with a trailer, you basically lose the ability to back up and change routes if traffic is blocked. You're pinning yourself in if you try to tow a trailer. And again, if you take the time to pack a trailer, those are valuable minutes that you're wasting where you should be on the road.
Hypothetically speaking, if, let's say, things got really nasty in the Middle East and, I don't know, maybe China and Russia got angry and it looked like the dollar might have a heart attack, would that be when it's time to start packing the back seat of the car?
Well, it's difficult to say how the situation might play out. But yes, if there are heightened tensions internationally, you might want to warn your employer that you are going to have to use up some vacation days and make those arrangements. You're going to want to contact whoever is overseeing your rural retreat to let them know that you're probably going to be on the way soon, and you need to start at least pre-packing your gear. And that would include doing some things that are sort of last minute. Like, for example, if you have medications or batteries that you keep stored in a refrigerator or freezer, you need to pull those out, warm those up to room temperature, and pack those in your bags to go. If there's any important documents that you need to leave out, or supplies of cash or precious metals or whatever, you need to go ahead and pack that with your gear to have it just ready to go. And then at some point, depending on the situation, yes, you're going to go ahead and pre-pack your vehicle, but then, of course, depending on where you live, then you're going to have the risk of having your car burglarized. So you really need to do that truly at the 11th hour. And the best time to get out of Dodge would actually be anywhere between 8 p.m. and 4 a.m. when there's the least traffic on the roads.
Okay, so what are some of the challenges or problems that characters face in Founders? It seemed to me that there were violent gangs and bad government, disease, and lack of food.
Mm-hmm. Those were some of them.
Some, but not all.
We had a non-functioning currency where the value of the dollar basically evaporated overnight. So basically any savings that people had or any investment that was dollar denominated was wiped out overnight. The only thing that held any real value were practical tangibles. So things like common caliber ammunition, gardening seed, consumables like batteries, storage food, that sort of thing, or fuel, would all hold their value, whereas anything that was expressed in dollar terms or it would essentially be wiped out. If you held paper currency or had a balance in a bank account, once inflation jumps from 20% to 100% to 1,000%, basically everything you have is gone within days. It's just eaten up in what in South America they refer to as el inferno, the furnace. It's just gone. So it's really important that people think these things through. And what I tried to show in Founders was different people in different stages of life and different circumstances. In Patriots, I showed pretty much an ideal group of people that were well coordinated, well planned, basically had their beans, bullets, and Band-Aids squared away for years. All those characters were based on real life friends of mine who had been preparedness minded for several years at least, if not decades. In my later novels, Survivors and Founders, I showed kind of a mix. I showed some people that were partially prepared and some people that weren't very well prepared at all, and showed how they too might be able to pull through times like this. For example, one of the characters in Survivors was a lady that just worked as an accountant, and she was on a very modest budget. Her husband was an automobile mechanic. They had just a few tools. They only had one gun for the whole family, a 12-gauge shotgun, and their chances of survival were fairly small. But she very wisely, when she saw the economy start to turn, sat down with her elderly grandmother who had lived through the Great Depression, and they formulated a plan to buy up gardening seed. And they went around, it was the fall of the year anyway, so a lot of the hardware stores and nurseries were closing out their gardening seed for the year, and they bought up all the gardening seed they could find. And she basically put her whole life savings, other than a few canned foods that she was able to find. But as the inflation started to kick in, she bought every packet of vegetable gardening seed that she could find. And it turned out to be a pretty wise move, because when she did need to bug out, gardening seed is actually quite compact. And she was able to just take these boxes of gardening seed, stuff them in her car, and go when the time was right. I don't want to give away too much of the story, but that was just one approach of where someone who had just modest means was able to adapt to the changing circumstances and pull through the situation. In the book Founders, one of the main characters is a Air Force NCO. He's a non-commissioned officer who does missile maintenance for the United States Air Force. His name is Joshua Watanabe. And I showed him teaming up. In his case, he was already dating the daughter of a rancher. And He'd already proposed marriage to her twice before and was turned down. But as the economy fell apart, he went and made one last attempt to marry this young lady and basically said, I won't take no for an answer. We need to get married, and here's why. And even though he was of modest means, he had a horse trailer, and a deer hunting rifle. Otherwise, he had no storage food whatsoever, no other preparedness gear. Before the crunch, he wasn't really preparedness-minded at all. He was just a guy who loved to ride horses and hunt deer. But he was able to adapt, and by teaming up with the right family, he was able to pull through. And that's one of the themes that runs through a lot of my writings is, as a Christian, I look at it from a prayerful standpoint, which is I constantly pray that I will be put in the right place at the right time with the right people if it fits in God's providence. That's what I pray for, and that's the way I run my life. I try. I don't just pray that things will turn out well. I do my best to make them happen. I really feel convicted to prepare for my family. And I show a lot of characters in my novel that operate from the same mindsets. In fact, all of my novels.
Yeah, very good. By the way, you get the reader thinking about how a collapse might play out, which I really like. As an example, you have some action at a military base in Montana. Mm-hmm. And I never really thought about what might go on in bases if things got grim. Would they be well-stocked, or would it be the opposite with large numbers of refugees fleeing?
Yeah, actually, it depends on the military organization, their location, and their circumstances. In this case, it's Malmstrom Air Force Base, which is kind of unusual because it's part of our nuclear alert facilities. And they only have a very small reserve of food. They're very dependent upon the civilian economy. They have a lot of outside civilian contractors that do things like food service for the military mess halls. They have a lot of dependency on the civilian economy. Now, in the case of the Air Force, their main asset is fuel. In the case of the United States Army and Marine Corps, their main assets would be ammunition at their ammunition supply points. But by and large, military organizations are not very well prepared, even for just the collapse of grid power. Their day-to-day operations are very dependent upon grid power. Most military facilities are set up with conventional heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. And because of that, when the power grid goes down, they're basically going to be freezing in the dark like everyone else. In the case of Malmstrom Air Force Base, which I fictionally showed in the novel, because they have a huge fuel tank farm, the base up until recently was a military airlift command base in addition to being a missile base. And at their main facility, which is just outside of Great Falls, Montana, they have some enormous fuel tanks. We're talking millions of gallons of JP4, for example. And I portrayed that. I kind of extrapolated what would happen in a situation where the power grids went down, the economy fell apart, and put myself in the shoes of the base commander and thought, well, what would I do? How would I actually carry on operations? And I realized that he would have to very quickly transition into the barter economy, and the main barterable item that he would have available would be all that JP4, which is formulated a lot like kerosene, and it can be run in a lot of diesel engines. So I showed this fictional commander basically having to release the vast majority of the soldiers, or the airmen, under his command because he simply wouldn't be able to feed them, and keeping a small cadre to as a skeleton crew to maintain operations and maintain, most importantly, the physical security of all those missile alert facilities, the MAFs, that are scattered all over western Montana.
Speaking of government bases, wouldn't people be desperately trying to get into FEMA camps or other military or government bases?
Either get into or get out of, I suppose.
Well, I mean, some of us, you and I might try to be getting out, right? But, people like blankets and, soup.
Well, the thing is, I don't think that FEMA is going... FEMA really isn't geared for anything more than a regional disaster of short term. FEMA is not really geared toward any long-term situation that would affect the entire country. They simply don't have the manpower, they don't have the logistics, and they certainly don't have the transportation to provide any sort of relief on a wide-scale basis. In fact, I like to think of FEMA as an acronym that actually stands for Foolishly Expecting Meaningful Aid. That's what FEMA stands for. They simply won't be able to provide for many people at all. And at best, they may be able to provide continuity of government. One of their not well-publicized missions is COG, continuity of government, where they provide shelter space for primarily state-level governments and a bit for the federal government. But FEMA won't be there, and the military won't be able to, the military will be hard-pressed to even keep their people on base if the situation gets bad enough that the economy falls apart and the power grids go down. They'll have trouble just feeding their own soldiers, sailors, and airmen, much less being able to provide disaster relief to an entire stricken national economy. I just don't think it's going to happen.
Well, I think a lot of people would be very disappointed or even feel a bit betrayed. A lot of time and energy and money is going into these kinds of things, and if they're not there when you need them, it's like after Hurricane Katrina.
Right.
It was a pretty disappointing performance.
It was a very disappointing performance, but it was almost predictable because you have, FEMA has some decent stockpiles of things like MREs and bottled water and that sort of thing scattered around the country. And they do a somewhat decent job if they can have transportation from point A to point B to manage a localized disaster situation. In the case of Hurricane Katrina, they had the supplies, but they simply couldn't get them from point A to point B. There were, virtually all the roads were flooded. You had large numbers of people that were stranded on little patches of high ground that had become islands, and it essentially became an inland naval operation, and FEMA didn't have boats. So the Louisiana National Guard was able to eventually get relief to people, but it turned out to be a tremendous snafu, and there was a lot of finger-pointing that went on afterwards about what went wrong, who was in charge, what bad decisions were made, and so forth. And it was just a string of bad decisions and a whole chain of circumstances that didn't allow aid to get from point A to point B.
So what happened in Eastern Europe after the fall of communism, and how would it be different in the U.S.?
Well, that was kind of a unique situation in that they went from a command-driven economy to a free market economy, and they had quite a bit of time in order to make that transition. People gradually opened up to free market economics. But during that transition, they still had the old command-driven economy infrastructure to rely upon. And that's why things didn't completely fall apart. And because the command-driven economy of the former Soviet bloc was very simplistic and very regimented, it could be pretty well depended upon even during the time of transition. And most importantly, people were already accustomed to a life of scarcity. They were already used to lining up for 8 hours just because there had been a rumor that a certain product was going to be available at a certain store. In fact, people would see lines and start to queue up in those lines, not even knowing what they were lining up for, but knowing that it must be something good if there was people lining up. So that was the kind of mentality that they had pre-existing the transition. The collapse that took place was more or less a political collapse more than a true economic collapse, because there was a time of transition. And granted, inflation got quite bad in Russia for a short period of time, past 100%. And in some of the Eastern Bloc countries, it got even worse than that. But the transition was fairly orderly. In the West, we have a completely different situation. We have a society that's aging, obese, out of shape physically, and incredibly dependent upon a system that keeps our grocery store shelves magically fully stocked every night. Electricity, lights that come on with a flip of a switch magically every morning without fail. Water that comes out of the tap, hot and cold, without fail every morning. We essentially have a very soft society that is not used to hardship. And if there's any major disruption, they won't be able to cope the same way that your average Eastern European did. Your average Eastern European was used to power failures that lasted 2 days to up to a week regularly. That's almost unheard of in the United States, outside of a few areas that are prone to windstorms or to ice storms. It just doesn't happen. People are geared completely different. There's a different mentality, a different mindset. People don't have a self-sufficient mindset or a third world mindset, which is a mindset that's geared towards scarcity and improvisation.
Well, it sounds like we've lost our rugged individualism.
Yes, we have. The pioneer spirit of the 19th century is just about gone in the United States. Most people in the United States, if the power grid went down, would not have the slightest idea of how they would provide heating and food and transportation for their families. It's absolutely foreign to them. Now, granted, there's a few people that have that mentality. We have a situation in our society right now where 98% of the population is fed by 2% of the population. Only 2% of the population in the United States is fully employed in either farming, ranching, or fishing. So those 2% are feeding the other 98%. When the power grid goes down, the vast majority of Americans are going to be completely clueless. And again, we have a society that is overweight and out of shape. We have a tremendous number of people that are dependent upon diabetic insulin. We have a tremendous number of people that are dependent upon CPAP, which is constant pressure, positive pressure breathing machines for sleep apnea. We have a tremendous number of people that are dependent upon all sorts of medical prosthetics and regular medication. We have a huge number of people that are on mood-altering antidepressant drugs, and the vast majority of them have no clue that if they go cold turkey, if their prescriptions run out, that they're going to go through a very, very rough transition period as they come off of those drugs. The side effects can be huge. We have
that's why in your novel, that's why you have so many people dying.
Yes,
is the medical system.
And of course, right, people are incredibly system dependent. Now, I mean, if you just take the number of people that are on kidney dialysis or medical insulin, that alone is a significant number. You add to that the people who have severe sleep apnea, anyone who is on any sort of prescription medication for any chronic ailments, whether it's heart disease or whatever. The die-off will be tremendous just from that segment of the population, not to mention the people who can't cope because the power grid has gone down. Their toilets won't flush, and by the way, that's going to cause a huge public health nightmare because, again, in third world nations, people know how to live without, they know enough to dig a privy, and they know enough not to, foul the water upstream from where people are drawing drinking water. People in the United States have no clue about that, and it's going to be a public health nightmare. So the die-off, if the power grids go down, depending on the time of year the grids go down, could be anywhere from 40% to 90% of the population. I'm not kidding.
That's quite a thought. And, of course, it would be overwhelmingly in the big cities, right?
Well, that's where the largest die-off would be. But even the suburbs, I think, are going to have a significant loss of life. Now, in the southern states, people might be able to get by because they won't be so dependent upon, bulk fuel for, won't be dependent upon natural gas for heating, for example. In the northern states, you're going to have two classes of people, those with wood stoves and those without. And those without are probably going to freeze to death the first winter. And the people with wood stoves, they better not have pellet stoves because those don't work without grid power. Even for the people that live in the countryside, Blaine, there's most people that live in the country are on well water, and they're dependent upon grid power to pump that water. And even some of them may end up as refugees unless they're on shallow wells and can adapt to either drawing water from open sources or whatever. The overnight change from 21st century technology to 19th century technology is going to be too much for most people. They won't be able to adapt.
Yes. On a different topic, you have a lot of interesting quotes in the novel before each chapter. They tend to get people thinking. One was about the development of hay and how that led to civilizations in cold climates. And then there was another one about liberty hanging on for dear life if there was a standing army or laws against self-defense. And so I was thinking, I take it you're a firm believer in hay, right?
I cut my own, yeah.
You're part of the hay.
And I kind of roll my own when it comes to cartridges, too. It is, I do put those quotes at the head of each chapter as kind of thought-provoking tidbits. And I try, it's part of what I weave into the novels as a thought exercise, to get people to think outside of the box, to think through the potential situation if we were to see the power grid go down, and to think through all those eventualities. And a lot of those quotes are quite pointed, and I try to select them with care.
Well, I actually really hadn't thought about the idea that before hay, you didn't really have big cities in cold climates.
You really can't.
You can't do it.
Yeah, it's not practical. And the advent of hay really only works in for an entire society, in a society that's still driven primarily by horsepower. We can't revert to that very easily. There simply aren't enough horses. It would take 20 years to breed up enough saddle horses and harness horses and draft horses to get back to that kind of economy. And not to mention, you'd have to build up a whole new industry building light wagons and all the tack that would be required. We'd have to have buggy whip manufacturers again. Yeah, that's the standing joke, amongst economists. But reversion to a 19th century economy in the event of either post-peak oil collapse or simply a power grid collapse would be quite daunting, and it would not be a simple transition.
Jim, a couple things surprised me in Founders. One was that almost no communication was restored within a few months, not even the Pony Express, really. And I'm imagining the lesson from that is that our high-tech civilization really couldn't survive a disease outbreak, which might take things over the cliff.
Right, that's one part of it. The other part, of course, is that the scenario that I put forth in Founders and the other novels was that essentially society broke down into very small enclaves, typically neighborhood size, or small towns, but nothing larger than that, simply because there was so much lawlessness that it was unsafe to travel any long distances, and that's why there couldn't be something like a Pony Express. Your Pony Express riders would all get eaten. And in a situation where the power grid goes down for an extended period of time, granted, there's a lot of ham radio operators that are now transitioning to photovoltaics. But if you go even to a ARRL-sponsored ham radio field day, it looks like something out of Camping World, because you've got everybody goes and fires up their own generators to run their ham radio gear for these field events. In a real-world disaster situation where there's no fuel available and the power grid is down, ham radio operators, by and large, I would say probably 60 or 70% of ham radio operators don't even have any photovoltaic panels. They don't have any way of making their own electricity. Once the gasoline is gone, they're out of business. There will be no communication. And of course, by the same token, the major telecommunications industry is almost entirely dependent upon grid power. If the grid goes down, on a local basis, the portions of the telephone network might still work, but that's only until the propane in the backup generator tanks runs out. And then you're going to end up with smaller and smaller islands of communication to the point where there's just nothing left. People living only a few miles apart will be completely in the dark as to what the situation of their neighbors are. It's almost unfathomable, because it's almost like a pioneer situation where you've got hostile Indians, for example, or for example, the Voortrekkers in South Africa, where they had hostile tribes, and these isolated pockets of settlers that were basically out of contact with anyone else for extended periods of time.
Yeah, that's kind of thought-provoking to think it could be that rough. Another thing that surprised me was that almost no government really appeared on the scene for some time. I would have expected NATO to jump in fairly quickly, possibly FEMA with a new currency or something.
Well, I did show a regional government that became a national government in the later portion of my novel. But I think there really will be a power vacuum in a grid-down collapse that takes down the American economy, because so much of the global economy is dependent upon the U.S. economy. I think that if our economy collapses, the whole world will collapse economically, and it may take quite some time before there's any really meaningful restoration of government. We really literally could see a complete collapse that could last decades. Now, for the sake of drama in my novel, I tried to make, a fairly realistic extrapolation of how events could go, with the formation of a regional government and then the invitation of foreign peacekeeping troops into the country. That's one possible way it would play out, but there's no certainty that even that would happen. We could literally see a dark age where the power grid could go down and not come back up for generations. That would be the worst case.
But don't they drill these things? I mean, NATO or FEMA, don't they have, worst case scenarios?
But it's all geared toward continuity of government and attempting to reestablish order. But once law and order breaks down and the highways become impassable, if the highways are controlled by gangs and you can't get any commerce flowing and you can't get any relief supplies moving, you end up with just pockets of civilization surrounded by absolute brigandage. That's what I portrayed in my novels. And I think that is, again, just one possible outcome. But it all hinges on the power grid. If the grid stays up, I think we'll end up in a situation roughly analogous to the Depression of the 1930s. But if the grid goes down, all bets are off, because we're incredibly dependent on the power grid for almost every aspect of our lives.
So true, so true. Well, now we'd like to bring in some other roundtable members. So, Romans, you have a question?
Yes. Hi, Jim. This is Romans 8:28 is true, but they call me Romans for short.
Okay.
I have all of your books, too, by the way. I'd like to ask a question here that was posed by forum member Green Meadow. She says, how have your books been received? After 2008, a lot of people were panicked about the future, and it seemed like your books were flying off the shelves. What is the mood now?
Well, there's still quite a bit of uncertainty about the economy. It's just been announced that the Federal Reserve is going to be pursuing quantitative easing round 3, which is monetization.
Right.
Which, of course, if you read the first chapter of my book, it all started with massive monetization, which is creating money out of thin air. In this case, they're using the Federal Reserve banks to buy up large quantities of a derivative, and which is mortgage-backed securities. If people are watching that and not panicky right now, they're not paying attention. That is one of the most dangerous economic signals that we've had in the past 10 years. It's just as bad, if not worse, than what we saw with the credit market collapse in Europe in 2008. The economic signs now, to my way of thinking, are actually worse than they were in 2008, because the global derivatives casino has built up even larger. It's 2 or 3 times the size that it was in 2008. The underlying economy is continuing to crumble. The only real growth in the economy that's going on right now is based upon artificial stimulus. The number of people that are unemployed or underemployed is approaching the number that we saw in the Great Depression of the 1930s. So if anyone's paying attention, they should be quite concerned right now. In fact, even more concerned than in 2008. There's a number of different factors in play right now that are quite troubling. And if people look at them seriously, they should probably be redoubling their efforts at preparing their families right now, because we're, if anything, closer to economic collapse now than we were in 2008. things could come unraveled very quickly at this point.
Yes, I agree with you.
Hello, Jim. This is Disaster Cat in Ireland.
Okay.
I noticed that the book Survivors has a greater range of ages and health situations of the major characters than were in Patriots. Could you please talk about some of the roles that the elderly and disabled may play in a post-collapse world?
Sure. I already mentioned one, which was the elderly grandmother of the seed lady, the storekeeper from Louisiana, and who ended up settling in Kentucky from Survivors. I think that the elderly, especially anyone that lived through the Great Depression of the 1930s, has a tremendous amount of folk knowledge that they can pass along to the current generation that will be of great use, of great utility. Your average American housewife right now does not know how to can foods, for example. But your average woman in the 1930s, the 1940s, certainly anyone who lived through World War II, got used to doing home canning using glass jars. And they have that collective, almost folk knowledge of how to do that sort of thing, all those practical skills. The same goes for gardening, for do-it-yourself mechanics, for home plumbing, for home wiring. There's a lot of skills that have basically been forgotten in the last 20 or 30 years. Part of it has been due to the technological advance of the vehicles coming out of Detroit, for example, and the level of technology in the home. Up until about 15 years ago, there were very few microcircuits that were really required to keep a house running. Thermostat was a traditional bimetal switch. It was a more of an electromechanical device. Nowadays, most thermostats have at least one microcircuit chip with a clock that's driving the whole works. Even your toaster and your clothes dryer have microcircuits in them right now, which adds vulnerability to electromagnetic pulse and to solar storms. So the whole level of sophistication has gone up in our society, and because of that, because you lift the hood of your car and are just confused by this giant mass of wires and umpteen vacuum hoses going different places, you really can't see what's going on with a modern car versus one made in the 1960s or earlier. It's daunting for a lot of people, and people have shied away from learning to take care of things themselves. They've entrusted the care of their cars to automobile mechanics who have a lot more in common with computer technicians than anything else nowadays. It's quite sophisticated. So what elderly people can bring to the table is the ability to have families revert to 1940s or earlier technology. You know, hand washing laundry and setting up clotheslines for drying clothes, for example. A lot of modern American men and women don't even have that basic concept. If the power grid goes down, they really wouldn't know how to wash clothes and hang them out to dry. I mean, it wouldn't even occur to them. And I know this may sound foreign to a lot of your listeners because they have a traditional self-sufficient mindset. But for so many Americans that are systems dependent, there's been a generational break that's taken place since the generation of the 1930s and 1940s. And other than a small segment of society that is relatively self-sufficient, the vast majority of Americans just don't have a clue. And if anyone's going to help them, it's going to be their grandparents, because they're folks that lived through the Depression of the 1930s and lived through the scarcity of World War II. They know how to pinch a penny, and they know how to make things work. Now, as for the handicapped, there's a potential there that is kind of untapped. And one of the things that I tried to show in my novels was that even people that are elderly, infirmed, or handicapped still have something that they can bring to the table. For example, in a situation of lawlessness where you have to have around-the-clock security, even someone who's in a wheelchair still has eyes that work and a voice that works, and they can be on guard to stand watch. If they can't stand the rigors of being outdoors, they can at least be on radio watch and be there to raise the alarm for a group retreat, for example. Even someone that's confined to a wheelchair, and I showed that in my novel Patriots, can still be functional to the point where they have valuable skills that they can pass on to others and where they can be productive. They're not completely out of the picture. Now, anyone who's dependent upon medical appliances is probably going to be out of luck, unfortunately. Anyone who's dependent on a pacemaker, a sleep apnea machine, kidney dialysis, umpteen different other medical marvels, when the grid goes down, they unfortunately are not going to be with us. We just have to face facts. We will do our very best to prepare for them, and that's a lot of what we talk about in Survival Blog, is doing our best to have workarounds using photovoltaic power and a lot of other technologies to provide for people who do have chronic medical conditions. But unfortunately, I hate to sound fatalistic, but a lot of those folks are just not going to be with us. They're not going to be able to pull through, and they won't be there to help. Now, for those that do survive, even someone who's blind, for example, can still be part of a practical solution. They can still be functional and still be integrated into a retreat community.
Okay, thank you. As kind of a follow-up, I was also kind of surprised that in neither of the two novels I read, and I haven't read the third one, do tasks like constant knitting, spinning, weaving, and especially mending really appear as a constant part of everyday life. The only work during communal socialization activity seems to be in the context of items needed directly for defense. And while I could kind of understand that being in Patriots for the first year because they're well supplied, I was pretty amazed that it was not part of daily life in later years, especially as it became obvious that clothing would not be easily replaced. Is there some reason why this constant production task, often done while doing something else, for example, I'm in the moment, I'm unraveling a sweater while listening to you and doing the interview, were not mentioned, or do you feel they are just not as high a priority even in a longer-term collapse?
Well, they're definitely a priority in long-term collapse. My late wife was a spinner and weaver, and I can certainly see the utility of that. But for a short-term situation, of course, they don't have tremendous utility because, especially in a situation where we have a die-off of population, there actually is going to be a lot of excess supplies in certain areas. And things like underclothing, socks and underwear, for example, really won't become an issue until 3 or 4 years into a problem like this, because we have a society that is very prosperous right now, and people, in the 19th century, when someone moved, they could put literally their entire life savings and household possessions into 1 or 2 wagons and go. We live in such a prosperous society that people have to put excess stuff into storage spaces because it won't fit in their homes. And nowadays homes are 2,000 or 3,000 square feet and still have trouble containing all the material wealth that people have. So it's now, granted, if we revert to a 19th century technology, traditional skills like spinning and weaving and felting are going to be very important. And we try to describe them in detail in Survival Blog and give people references and recommend references that people should have on their bookshelf. Most people have no clue, for example, how felt is made. It's incredibly simple to make, but unless you have the knowledge that you're going to need wool and water and soap to make it work, most people have no clue. And it's a skill that you can teach someone pretty quickly and easily. Now, hand spinning is a little bit more difficult to teach, and weaving is a lot more difficult to teach, especially the warping process. But it's not rocket science, and people can figure it out. But it is important that people go ahead and buy things like a spinning wheel, and buy things like a drum carder or a pair of cards, and go ahead and buy at least a table loom, which is a fairly simplistic loom. Or if they have the money, go ahead and buy an upright treadle loom. That'd be fantastic. If you have the space for it and you have the money to buy one, more power to you. But again, I don't think it's going to be a priority until about 3 or 4 years into the problem.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hi, Jim. Moving to a different topic, Green Meadow suggested this question. The book ends with a massive move to restore the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. What are your thoughts about what's happening to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and is there a way to get them back without a total collapse?
Well, there certainly is. My personal view is that our constitutional liberties are in peril at this point because of technological advances that make tracking people and keeping tabs on their daily thoughts because of things like Facebook. That technology has advanced to the point where we are at great risk that if there was ever any group that attempted to take power and institute a draconian government, that they could very easily control our population because they literally know where everyone is at any given time, and they know exactly what they're thinking about. They even know what they had for breakfast because people have become unintentionally have become intelligence gatherers for the police state. And if anyone wants to set up a police state, all they have to do is tap into the billions of digits that are flowing every day that are showing the pace or the thought processes and pace of life and activities of virtually everyone in the country. There's very few people who are completely off the grid and uninvolved in social and networking, for example. In fact, there's recently been a number of newspaper articles that have mentioned the fact that if someone is a job applicant for any position other than menial labor, and they don't have a Facebook account, be under suspicion as an undesirable character, simply because they don't have a Facebook account. It looks suspicious. So I have great concern that our constitutional liberties, especially since September of 2001, have eroded significantly, and we're at risk of slipping into a totalitarian government, a truly draconian government, if we're not careful. Now, I do have hope for the political process, but I do think that we're going to at least have to see some economic turmoil before there's any major movement toward a push toward a sound constitutional currency that's backed by gold and silver. I think unless or until the banking system essentially collapses or the value of the dollar collapses, there won't be the political will required to institute honest currency. It just won't happen because the bankers essentially are the oligarchy that are running our nation right now. They're not doing it directly, they're doing it indirectly, but they're doing it quite cleverly. And if you look at the way our government works, the way lobbying works, and the budget process works, they basically have it in the bag. The bankers are calling the shots, and if you look at legislation, it's always to the favor of the bankers. And if you look at the government bailouts that have taken place, the vast majority of it has not been benefiting, Joe average citizen. They've been to the benefit of the banking elite. They're the ones who are gaining power and gaining wealth, and the middle class is starting to evaporate. The lower class is starting to get larger. And if things continue on track without a major break, we could very well, within the next 20 or 30 years, see the middle class, disappear almost completely. We could see a very sharp division between the classes, with a very small elite upper class and a very large lower class. It would not be a very enviable situation, and unfortunately, I could see that happening unless there is a major economic break that would shake people up to the point where they will change the government and reinstitute a constitutional government and a much smaller, more austere and responsible government. I think that at this point, it's probably our only hope, because if you look at the march of events through the 20th century and now into the early 21st century, it's been almost relentless. We keep getting bigger and bigger government and bigger swings in the economy. We see the upper class is the banking elite class is gaining power and gaining wealth, and the middle class is starting to shrink, and the lower class is and it's the lower class that's growing. It's not a good situation, and my prayer is that we will have a restoration of a constitutional government, a restoration of individual liberty, a scale back of government across the board at all levels, all the way from the county, state, and federal level, radically scaled back, so that governments will not be in the business of trying to arbitrate every aspect of our daily lives, which is what they're on the verge of doing right now. We need a smaller libertarian government, and I don't think that's going to happen unless there is some major shakeup, and I think that'll probably be economic rather than military.
Well, would you see us moving away from perhaps the national government to smaller regional or state governments?
I think that's the logical progression. And in fact, if you look at the advance of internet technology, we no longer need to have a seat of government in one place. We could have a federal government that's much smaller and distributed. And if you look at it from a strategic standpoint, if you look at biological warfare and nuclear warfare, we live in the age of both. That's probably is the practical way to run a federal government. You don't want to have one seat of government that's a target. So we could have a small federal government and then a still small but more independent state and regional governments, or right down to the county level. I still look at the county as the ideal level of government, the level that's the building block of our society, and a lot of that's become lost in recent years because of the federalization of local law enforcement, for example, and federalization of the National Guard bureaus. But ideally, what we should have is a quite uncentralized, quite disparate and widespread collection of local governments, and the state governments really would only be involved in the bigger issues like transportation and protecting patent rights and that sort of thing. There's really no need for big governments in a society that's fully connected by the internet. It's really a dinosaur when you come right down to it. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is just the opposite, which is a centralization of power. And part of that centralization of power that's going on is control of not just dollars, but control of information. And the powers that be are currently holding the reins of the internet, and they are using large databases, unfortunately, to start to control people. That's what's going on. We should actually be seeing a move in the opposite direction. We should see decentralization, an increase in personal liberty, an increase in personal responsibility and local government. That's the ideal solution.
I agree. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
We are speaking with James Wesley Rawles. You can learn more about him and preparedness at his website, www.survivalblog.com. And now we're moving on to another topic, which is how collapse could happen. And Disaster Cat, you have the first question.
Jim, in your novels, the collapse comes not from just one source or disaster, but from several things that combine to collapse things over a period of days and weeks. Do you still think this is the most likely way a collapse will happen, or do you now feel it is more likely to happen more quickly or from just one event?
Well, I think it probably will play out something like I portrayed in my novels. There's a lot of interdependence of systems in the United States, but they all tie back to the power grid. As I mentioned in the last hour, the power grid really is the linchpin of modern technological societies. And if you have a lot of dependence upon the grid, it doesn't take a lot for things to come unraveled. For example, most commerce is now tied to computer systems for automatic ordering and reordering of products under the Japanese model, the Kanban model of just-in-time inventory control. This keeps the inventories on your store shelves quite lean and very efficient. And from the standpoint of the bean counters, it's a fantastic situation where inventories are kept quite small. If they're in a jurisdiction where there's taxation on inventory, the taxation is minimized, and the efficiency of not having products sitting idle is tremendous. The flip side to that, of course, is if there's any kind of disruption whatsoever, it's an incredibly fragile system, and it has very little resiliency, and it doesn't take very much for it to all fall apart. That's just one example of technological dependence. By the same token, we are becoming more and more dependent upon the GPS network for everything from communications to transportation to commerce. And any disruption in GPS could cause its own chain of events to take place. And we have a telecommunications network that is similarly very dependent upon grid power. Going beyond that, we have a tremendous dependence upon electrically pumped water for both civic water supplies, civic sanitation, and for agriculture. And that whole infrastructure is also inextricably tied to grid power. So there could be any number of different events, and it doesn't have to be the same chain of events that I portrayed in my novel. The key trigger event is the collapse of the three North American power grids. There's actually three in the United States. There's an eastern grid, a western grid, and a Texas grid, just because Texas has to be a little bit different. But basically, if any or all of those three grids were to go down, life as we know it would cease to exist unless those grids come back up within a couple of weeks. Well, perhaps 4 weeks in summertime, but just a couple of weeks in wintertime. Because if once the power is down for 3 days, the civic water supplies are going to run out. Almost all civic water supplies now use electrical pumping to pump water up to gravity-fed towers. Well, those towers only have about a 72-hour supply on average of water. If the grid is down, water can't be pumped back up to those towers. The clock is ticking. After 3 days, people's water won't be running, and 2 or 3 days after that, we're going to have huge numbers of refugees on the road. It's unfortunately an inevitable chain of events. And again, the one linchpin is grid power.
Given that, what do you think is the most likely scenario that might cause this to happen at this present time? I mean, I realize that in your, for example, in your book.
At present, I think there's actually two. One would be an EMP event that would take down the power grid, and the other would be an economic collapse that would take down the power grid with a delay. The delay being, if there's an economic collapse, riots in the streets, and law and order breaks down to the point where public employees and utility employees don't feel safe to go to work, excuse me, at that point, the grid is likely to collapse because there simply will be no one minding the switch. There'll be no one there to make sure that there's an uninterrupted flow of power. Now, there's some areas in hydroelectric producing areas and in natural gas producing areas where there'll be some power utilities that are able to revert to what's called islanding, is the term they use within the power industry, where they can island their power, disconnect themselves from the national grid, and create a miniature grid just for their own network. And in fact, I've had conversations with electric power utility managers that tell me that they're able to switch to islanding mode within minutes if they can see that the national power grid is not going to come back up. They can island their own, create their own mini grid locally. But by and large, outside of hydroelectric areas like the Pacific Northwest and outside of natural gas areas like certain portions of Texas and New Mexico and Oklahoma, most power utilities are going to go down and stay down. And then to come back up is complicated in itself. The power grid is all geared with the presupposition that some small grids will still be operating, and that power can be used to restart the coal-fired plants and the natural gas-fired plants and the nuclear plants to bring them back online. That's what's referred to as dark startup. But the dark startup process, unfortunately, is becoming more and more complicated with every passing year, partly because of regulations from organizations like the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that won't allow a nuclear power plant to come back online unless the grid is operating. That's one of their safety standards, is they want to be able to rely on grid power to operate the pumps, the cooling pumps for nuclear power plants. By law, a nuclear power plant cannot start back up unless grid power exists. They cannot do it legally. It just cannot be done because of NRC regulations. By the same token, the large coal-fired plants cannot bring themselves back online unless they have outside grid power, at least locally, or local grid power, to be able to bring their plants back online. Same for natural gas power plants. The bigger the plant, the bigger the problem. And dark startup is already quite complicated, and it's going to become more complicated as time goes on. That's just one example of systems dependence that could if the power grid does go down, could make it very difficult for it to come back up. And that is, again, just one chain of events. The other major scenario that I could see would be involving either nuclear electromagnetic pulse or its natural equivalent, which is a Carrington event, which is a solar flare that would have essentially the same effect as EMP, which would put a massive jolt through our power grid and through our telecommunications grid, and virtually every electronic device that contains microcircuits that's connected to grid power or to the telecommunications network will get fried. And the technology required to put Humpty Dumpty back together again would be a tremendous effort. The best that we could hope for would be that, for example, say Europe were to get hit by a solar storm, but the United States wasn't, or vice versa. And then the other countries could help out the stricken country by shipping in, huge quantities of stored microcircuits and to attempt to get things put back together. They would be able to ship in large numbers of power transformers to get the power network put back together. Unfortunately, there aren't large numbers of spare transformers. They're actually built with a 36-month lead time by all the major manufacturers, and there's not a lot of spares that exist. Worst case would be we'd have a series of solar storms that would drop the power grids globally. It would be very, very difficult to put things back together again. You can't just jump right back in and start making microcircuits. It uses photo lithography at an amazing scale. It's now at the submicron level of technology that they use for making microcircuits. Here's the kicker. It takes microcircuits to make microcircuits. So if all the microcircuits are destroyed, how do you start making new ones? Interesting quandary.
Thank you very much. It was a great answer.
Well, Jim, this is Plain again. That last answer, that really encapsulated the whole problem, didn't it? We can't fix something if what we need is part of the solution.
Right.
So we're in a lot of trouble there. Anyway, moving on. Many are not so worried about one disaster, such as a huge ice storm, but more a combination of the whole country or region going down the drain, including the government, businesses, and their fellow man. So it seems a bit overwhelming at times. What do you recommend for this situation, which somewhat resembles the 1930s and 40s?
Well, assuming that commerce hangs in there and the power grid stays up, I think the most important thing that families can rely upon is local economy. We could see a situation where there's great economic turmoil, massive layoffs, a devaluation of the United States dollar, for example. And if you look at what's going on in Greece right now, their approach locally has been to set up essentially a farmer's market on steroids. Large numbers of people are going back to large-scale gardening and farming. People are trading amongst themselves because there's such a shortage of euros. There's so few people working and so few euros greasing the economy. People are setting up local currencies. People are bartering informally, and they're networking. They're even taking advantage of the internet to network locally so that they can keep a local economy going. They can keep people working and keep food on the table and medicine on the shelves. So I think that is the model that we should probably look at for most of the problems that we're facing right now. Because a lot of what we discussed in the last hour was truly the worst case, the grid down situation. But in a grid up situation, which is actually more likely, I know it's a lot of fun to talk about grid down, but from a practical standpoint, odds are, unless there is something like a solar flare or an EMP event, the grid will stay up. We really need to concentrate primarily on getting local economies, local barter networks, local currencies. If you look at, for example, the Ithaca dollar, that's a really good exercise for people, just to do a quick web search on Ithaca, New York dollar. They created a local currency there more than 20 years ago, which is still flourishing, and which has basically had no inflation because it's all based on hours of labor. And governments can print as many dollars as they want in fiat currencies, but when you have a local currency that's denominated in hours of human labor, you can't unless someone cheats and prints extra certificates, you basically can't have inflation in that system because an hour is still an hour, whereas a dollar can be $100 or $1,000 or $100 trillion, as what happened in Zimbabwe. So it's important that people start thinking locally, networking locally, and team up with your neighbors and friends. Now, of course, from a survivalist standpoint, you want to be very circumspect about what you let on to your neighbors and friends and coworkers and church congregants. You don't want to let everyone know that you have a 2-year food supply, or you're not going to have a 2-year food supply. You have to be very quiet about some things, but there's no reason why you can't network locally with folks and be fairly quiet about the full extent of your preparations. Get people engaged in barter now. If you gain bartering skills now, you'll have those in your pocket, or should I say between your ears, for when you really need them, if things do fall apart. So learn from the Greeks. Watch what's going on there and be ready to emulate that, and start emulating it as much as possible through your local farmers market, through co-ops, and so on.
Do you think there's a good chance of this 1930s scenario playing out?
Yes, there is, although the Depression of the 1930s was fully deflationary. My personal prediction is that we're going to see another year or two of deflation followed by massive inflation, and it's going to have a whipsaw effect that's going to basically destroy the life savings of the vast majority of Americans, because anyone who leaves their money in dollars once inflation kicks in is going to, again, be wiped out. So unlike the 1930s, I think we will see deflation followed by inflation. In the 1930s, it was deflationary all the way through, and people were able to kind of muddle through and, grow a big garden, live frugally, and pull through. In the present time, with the way our economy is so intertwined, I think that we are going to be in for a rude shock when we see a period that looks like the 1930s turn into something completely different. It'll look like Weimar Germany or Zimbabwe, where we, at basically the flip of a switch, that overnight we're going to see a switch from deflation to massive inflation. And there, the trigger will be interest rates. People should keep a very close eye on interest rates. Currently, our own government is pursuing a policy called ZIRP, which stands for Zero Interest Rate Policy. They're keeping interest rates insanely low, artificially low, and they're going to continue to do that as long as they can. But at some point, America's foreign creditors that are holding lots of Treasury paper are going to insist upon a higher rate of return for them to renew those debts. And that's going to be the breaking point. That's the point at which interest rates are going to start to jump. And they're not going to just jump from 2 or 3% to 5 or 6%. They're going to jump from 2% to 15%, and then 30%, and then 80%. It's once inflation kicks in, once we have that emperor without clothes moment, then the inflationary cascade will start, and it will be absolutely unstoppable. We live in a information age. There won't be any slow realization that there's inflation. There'll be a very quick realization that there's inflation, and then an immediate expectation of further inflation. Inflation tends to feed itself. So be ready for that. Watch interest rates like a hawk. When they turn, be ready to get completely out of dollars and into tangibles as quickly as possible. Otherwise, you're going to be completely blindsided.
Do you see much of a chance of, let's say, capital controls and I guess you might say an international boycott of the dollar or something? So the dollar system inside the U.S. would continue as it is, but basically things would change dramatically outside the U.S.
That's conceivable, but unfortunately, we don't have a economy that's independent. We have a economy that's very closely tied, especially to Canada and the Eurozone, and to a lesser extent Mexico. But it truly is a global economy that we're in, and if anything, I think there will be capital controls. There will be limits on how much, say if there's a banking crisis, there'll be limits on how much you can withdraw from your bank. And there will certainly be limits on moving currency beyond borders. That'll be one of the very first things that'll happen. And if you look at what's going on today, there's already a glimmer of what's to come. We're going to see some very stringent capital controls. And ironically, one of the capital controls that's taken place recently, Switzerland has actually tried to stop currency inflows into their country because the Swiss franc has gotten too strong, and they've lost competitiveness for their products in international trade. It's kind of an ironic situation where they have kind of a reverse capital control saying, no, we don't want your money. Please don't bring your money here. There's too much of it. In most cases, it'll be the other way around, of course. Countries will insist that depositors in banks leave their money right where it is, and that they are not allowed to move their money offshore.
But Jim, don't other countries like Brazil or China look at QE as essentially being an act of war? I mean, we have quotes along those lines. So, I mean, what you're saying Switzerland's doing is totally logical. I mean,
it is.
Those flood of dollars,
I don't blame them whatsoever. Yeah, I don't blame them whatsoever. But as things play out, it's difficult to predict how national governments are going to react. But certainly, we're going to see attempts at greater control. There'll be attempts at wage and price controls, just like the 1940s and the 1960s. There'll be attempts at pegging different currencies at various points to other currencies or to commodities. There'll be attempts to stop the flow of currency or investments from one point to another, from one nation to another. There'll be all sorts of controls that are attempted. But if you look at the history of wage and price controls, for example, they really don't work well because they go against free market economics, and human nature tends toward free market economics. So people tend to start working around things like wage and price controls very quickly. Black market economies will spring up, gray market economies, and people will begin to work around controls pretty quickly. The same goes for currency controls. You know, if we have a situation right now where we cannot stop the flow of drugs into the country, well, drugs are basically analogous in terms of bulk and weight to paper currency. So if people can smuggle drugs without getting caught, they can certainly smuggle cash without getting caught. So I think that there'll be workarounds that spring up. They're certainly not going to be, quote, legal, unquote, but...
Does cash still exist? No, just kidding.
Yeah,
but the issue, I think, is the digit dollar, isn't it? I mean, the issue is more like at the big level with the banks and everything.
There aren't enough paper dollars to reflect the electronic dollars that exist. 95 out of every $100 does not exist in printed form. It's a bookkeeper's entry on some computer somewhere. And an interesting thing will happen if we have an economic crisis and that turns into bank runs. There literally won't be enough cash for people to withdraw everything they need. And certainly the national governments will very quickly say, okay, sorry, you can only withdraw $100 per person per day or something like that, because otherwise they'll simply run out of cash. Now, an interesting inflationary thing will happen at the tail end of that, and that is the government's going to have to react to bank runs by cranking up the printing presses, and they'll probably switch over, as I mentioned in my first novel, Patriots, they'll switch the intaglio printing presses that currently produce $1 bills and produce $100 bills with them so that they can meet the demand for cash for massive withdrawals of currency. Well, then an interesting thing will happen. Now, on its face, a bank run is actually deflationary because it removes the money multiplier effect that bankers depend upon by being able to lend out currency over and over and over again. So that's deflationary. But an interesting thing happens. When people have extra cash in their pockets, they're going to want to start converting that cash into tangible goods. And that's actually going to breed inflation at a local level, at the base level in the local economy. So after everyone finally gets their money out of the banks, it may take months. Then I think inflation will set in. And here I'm talking consumer price inflation, not core inflation.
Okay. Next question is going to Lenny.
Hi, Jim. Time Monk member McLaren comments that since natural disasters are typically localized or regional events, in what ways do you see the possibility of a butterfly's wings flapping and spreading to a much larger area of impact?
Well, it's difficult to say exactly what will happen. Certainly, as I mentioned before, the government is not geared toward being able to react to a national disaster, only localized disasters or regional disasters at most. And the reaction of individual folks in the citizenry is difficult to predict as well. Most people haven't thought through the full implications of something like a grid down collapse, and they are not psychologically prepared for it. The government agencies, even with their sand table exercises or simulations, are not really truly prepared for anything beyond regional level problems. I have a lot of faith, however, in human nature and in free market economics. And I think that even if the United States dollar, as we knew it, were to disappear, as we know it now, were to disappear, the free market is going to very flexibly, by means of the invisible hand, react and set up a parallel economy, a parallel currency, whether it'll be silver-backed or gold-backed or, for goodness sake, bushels of wheat-backed, whatever it takes. I have a lot of faith in the economy to bounce back. Even if the politicians screw things up royally and they totally destroy the dollar, we only have to look at the example of Zimbabwe, where they reverted to another nation's currency. In this case, they used the South African rand and the U.S. dollar. Their inflation got so bad that they literally had to abandon their currency. It became not just badly inflated, but completely worthless, as in worth only its only value really was as tinder for lighting fires or for toilet paper. So I think that there's the potential for the economy to bounce back, probably starting at the local level, and to revert and to pick up the ball where the government's dropped it. The invisible hand of the economy will pick up the ball and run with it.
Thank you.
Yes, Jim, this is Romans. I have a very astute question here from forum member McLaren. He says, you write about the economy driving collapse in the derivatives market specifically as the high probability of a man-made end of the world as we know it economic collapse. Many people agree. Yet those that have the most to lose, the giant global banks, also tend to be the dominant players in those markets. They also have the backing of the global central banks that stand ready to bail them out. Why and how would these markets fail?
Well, the power elite has a lot to lose, and they stand to lose a lot if there's a total collapse. I think what they're hoping for is a series of minor shocks to the economy like 2008, where they can then have a whole series of bailouts and inflate new bubbles in the economy and keep their derivatives casino running indefinitely and keep the banking system running with the full agreement and compliance of national governments. What they fail to see is that the situation could spin out of control, and that they think that they're orchestrating a series of minor shocks, but at some point the whole situation could escape them. It could become, as I mentioned before with mass inflation, for example, become a self-fulfilling prophecy where even if they try to control it, they can't, where the situation will spin completely out of control. Also, they've built up these infrastructures in essentially a house of cards. If you look at the derivatives market, for example, the counterparty risk is tremendous and growing with every passing day. If you look at the global credit market, the level of sophistication of some of the instruments that are being employed right now is to the point now where if, one trader gets out of control, he could literally crash an entire market. So the level of sophistication and interdependency has built up to the point where even if the global banking elite wishes to limit problems to minor economic shocks that are only felt regionally, there's the potential now for the situation to get completely beyond their control, for the stock market collapse, for example, in one country to turn into a global stock market collapse, and a currency collapse in one nation leading to collapses in other nations, for a derivatives collapse to affect not just one industry, but whole sectors of the economy with tremendous counterparty risk to the tunes of trillions of dollars that don't even exist. Currently, the global derivatives market has a notional value of somewhere around $600 trillion. It's more money than exists in the entire world, and it's in play on any given day. The counterparty risk is almost incalculable. And right now, the derivatives market hums along very nicely. It's essentially a form of insurance for people that are involved in the credit market and in the commodities markets. And it will continue to hum along nicely, and every transaction, in effect, is a zero-sum gain at the end. But that's only if both the party and counterparty continue to exist. If a counterparty disappears for some reason, we could see a situation where there could be a balance sheet loss that would make, a J.P. Morgan situation or a Shearson Lehman situation look like small potatoes. We're talking tens of trillions of dollars in counterparty risk. And even if a government were to attempt to make good by bailing out the banking parties, stepping in the position of the counterparty and creating that money out of thin air, by solving that problem, they would be creating a much larger one. They'll be sowing the seeds of massive inflation. If they have to create, say, $100 trillion out of thin air overnight, I don't think that's going to go unnoticed. Certainly not by the commodities market, certainly not by the currency markets. It's going to have huge repercussions that they'll be like sea billows rolling across the Atlantic. It will be a tsunami effect it has not been seen before by any modern society, and will probably only be seen once and never be seen again, because in the aftermath of this, it'll be so overwhelming if we do have a derivatives collapse that national governments simply will not allow that large of a derivatives market to ever build up again. It'll be seen as too risky. So it'll be a one-time event of such staggering proportions that it will go down in history as a defining moment, a defining turning point for Western societies. It'll be that tremendous.
Okay, thank you very much for that very thought-provoking answer there. Another question from Time Monk member McLaren. He wonders if, given that many of these city folks won't know much about country or rural living, won't they overwhelm the rural residents? What about the gang problem migrating to plunder the countryside?
That's definitely a problem. That's what I portrayed in my novel. And that's one reason why even rural retreats, I don't think will be able to exist manned by a single family. There'll probably be at least 3 or 4 families in a defensive pocket required to maintain 24-hour security at a rural retreat. If you look at the demographics of the situation that I put forth in my novels, again, we have 2% of the population currently feeding the other 98%. If the system breaks down and large numbers of refugees pour out of the cities and the suburbs, they're going to impact the adjacent rural agricultural areas very heavily. I wouldn't, for example, want to set up a rural retreat in the Central Valley of California. It's one of the breadbaskets of America, but it's so close geographically to major population centers that the farmers living in the Central Valley of California, I think, will simply be overwhelmed. They'll be outnumbered 100 to 1. And even if they wanted to maintain security, and even if they managed to maintain a bit of security, how are they still going to maintain farming operations? And even if they can produce a crop, how are they going to get that crop to market? Other than maybe perhaps a very localized barter economy, I think that there'll be huge. Not only will there be huge shortages of food, but there'll be tremendous amounts of food that go to waste, that simply rot in the fields, because there won't be anyone to harvest it, either because there won't be transportation or there won't be enough security for anyone to feel safe to leave their homes to go harvest crops. You can see what a house of cards we've created here.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's a real put very well. Appreciate that.
Okay, Jim. The next category is being prepared for and living in collapse. Disaster Cat, you have the next question.
Jim, in your survival manual, you do mention the need to practice gardening before things get bad. But in the novel Patriots, the group just ignores this sort of until the second year. Then when they realize the situation isn't going to recover soon. Well, I think that makes sense from the point of view of mostly urban survivalists planning a well-stocked retreat. I was really kind of surprised that the farmer's daughter, who joins a bit later, didn't call a group meeting and take them to task about how much danger they could be in from doing this. I was also surprised that everything just seemed to go pretty well and there were no years of really scary garden failures. Was this just because it would have complicated the plot of the book, or has this been your general experience that well-tended gardens usually produce pretty well? Hint, it hasn't been ours. No matter how much effort you put in, sometimes the weather is only sometimes your friend.
Yeah, well, here at our ranch, we've had a very pitiful gardening season. And part of the reason that I showed that approach was because I wanted to show kind of the typical survivalist mindset for that particular, that was kind of personified by that group. And that is, a lot of people think that they can pull through a situation simply with stored food. But the fact of the matter is, in any long-term collapse, there's no way that you're going to have enough stored food for any decent-sized group. You're going to have to, at the very minimum, start sprouting immediately. Sprouting could be started even in an urban setting with no light whatsoever. All you need is water and the right temperature. You can do it in the dark. Sprouting would be the absolute first thing. Anyone who's planning to garden is going to have to get a very early start on their garden to extend their growing season. So they're going to have to start all their seed in kitchen window arrangements or tray gardening, or by building cold frames or greenhouses to get started on gardening. And then another trap that people get themselves into is they think, well, I'm only going to store non-hybrid seeds because I can save that seed and it'll be the most productive in the long term. But unfortunately, if you're going to have to feed a lot of people in the short term, you're going to have both hybrid seed and non-hybrid seed. You're going to need hybrid seed for production in the short term, and the non-hybrid seed for a long-term solution. There's a very steep learning curve with gardening. Unless people have practiced it in their local climate of their retreat, with their local soil, and with their local pests and vermin, then they really don't have a clue as to what's required. You really need to have at least 2 or 3 years practice, preferably a typical year and a drought year, to know how you're going to react and how to manage to pull out any kind of yield whatsoever from a garden. And unless you're doing it there at your retreat, you're really not getting the full benefit of practice, because you need to have the local soil and the local climate. Microclimates make quite a difference in terms of what varieties grow well. And typically, it's not just a 2 or 3 year process, but a 4 or 5 year process, because you have to experiment with different varieties to find out what does produce well in your area. So that, again, there's a very steep learning curve, and part of the way that I portrayed it in my first novel was essentially for the sake of drama, because I wanted to show a situation where this group was quite dependent on their stored food and quite protective. Again, it was for drama, but I do recommend that people get started at gardening immediately. That if nothing else, even for someone listening to this who lives in an apartment where they don't even have a exterior porch to garden on, they can at least do some indoor gardening and especially sprouting. Practice sprouting now. Get used to it, and get the bugs out of the system so that you can sprout in large quantity as needed at the drop of a hat. We want to be able to produce a decent quantity of food pretty quickly, and sprouting is the easiest way to do that, even again for someone who has doesn't even have the room for square foot gardening. That's my advice. For anyone who has the potential to go ahead and do large-scale gardening, I highly recommend that you get an early start. Do it now. Don't think that because you've stocked away seeds and tools and fencing material that you have everything that you need. It takes time to build up soil. It takes time to build up rootstock for things like berry bushes, for example. It takes a lot of time to establish fruit and nut trees. And it even takes time to build up an asparagus bed. I mean, they really don't get into full production for about 3 years. So it's very important that people take the time to do it now, practice while the stress is low, and practice while the implications of failure are nothing worse than having to go to the store and buy food. If you wait until the implications is starvation, you've waited too long.
Thank you. That's kind of been our experience, was that we had several failures before we had success, and even then sometimes we have years when it fails. So it was really appreciate that.
Jim, I have a question. This is Lenny. You mentioned that the Central Valley wouldn't be such a good place to be because people might overrun the Central Valley area. But what about the San Bernardino Mountains where Arrowhead is and Big Bear? Some folks have mentioned that would be a safe place. What are your thoughts?
Well, there you run into a different problem, and that is it's not a food-producing area, but it's a known resort area. And I have always discouraged my readers and my consulting clients from buying a retreat property in any known resort area. And here I'm talking about places like Hot Springs, Arkansas, or Lake Arrowhead, or Big Bear, or Lake Tahoe, or the Poconos, for example. In a nationwide disaster situation, a thought process is inescapable, and that is that your average urbanite or suburbanite who is running out of food is going to think, well, gee, I need to get out of the city. Where will I go? Oh, I think I'll go and break into someone's vacation cabin because there won't be anyone there. And there I'll find a liquor cabinet full of liquor, a kitchen pantry full of food, and sleeping bags, and a bearskin rug, and a stack of firewood. That's how they envision a vacation cabin, okay? Well, the problem is you multiply that by about 100 million times, because you've got far more people who want to go to those vacation cabins than those who actually own them. And any resort area is going to get absolutely overwhelmed with refugees that want to break in and steal or occupy. And for anyone who owns a retreat property that they don't occupy year-round, they could be in the very unenviable situation of arriving at their retreat only to find that it's already occupied and gun barrels pointing at them. So I do not recommend an area like Big Bear or Lake Arrowhead, like you mentioned, or any other resort area. What you want to find is a lightly populated agricultural area that does not have resort appeal. So you're not going to be looking for lakefront property. You're going to be looking for out in the middle of farming country. You're going to be looking for a property that's on the side road of a side road. That's what I use that phrase over and over again with my consulting clients because it's an important one to remember. You don't want to be on a natural line of drift for refugees or looters. You want to be well removed from any line of drift. You want to be off of not just the freeways and the highways, but you even want to be off of the major county roads. You don't want to be right on a farm-to-market road. You want to be off on a side road of a side road. Because if you look at it from the standpoint of the inverse square law, as refugees pour out of the big cities, they're going to follow the natural lines of drift, and they're going to attenuate themselves into the countryside. The farther into the countryside you are, the fewer refugees there'll be. It's just a mathematical certainty. The farther you are from any major line of drift, from any major refugee route, the safer you're going to be. There's simply going to be fewer and fewer refugees. And when you get back onto some little side road of a side road that's 300 miles away from any major population center, you're not going to you'll be lucky if you see any refugees. They simply are not going to make it there. Will have either long since settled or have become fertilizer much closer to the big cities.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you. Green Meadow had a question that I want to ask you, which is, what are some of the differences between survival groups and sustainability groups, and what roles do they have to play if we face a collapse?
Well, we have a lot in common. Survivalists tend to be much more pragmatic and fatalistic, and sustainability groups tend to be Pollyanna-ish in their outlook, and they're always looking on the bright side of things and have a far different view of human nature, and that is they tend to look at everyone as part of the solution, as opposed to a survivalist looking at perhaps 1 out of every 10 person coming down the road as part of the solution and everyone else being simply a problem. So while our outlooks are completely different, the interplay between survivalists and sustainability groups and local agriculture groups, for example, or community sustainable agriculture groups, CSAs, for example, are a prime example. We have a lot to learn from each other. We have a lot to share with each other, but I don't think we'll ever see eye to eye on some issues. And while I fully endorse folks getting involved in local farmers markets and CSAs, for example, and food co-ops, my recommendation is don't get sucked in to thinking that their way of looking at the world through rose-colored glasses is reality. It really isn't. They hope that real change can come from local cooperation just by itself, and that true sustainability and long-term potential for self-sufficiency can come at the local level. But my inner prepper tells me that that's wishful thinking, because unfortunately what has to happen first is a population die-off. There's simply no way that we could have a reversion to 19th century technology and community-based agriculture and decentralization without first a population die-off, because we simply no longer have the either the infrastructure or the manpower the skilled manpower, that is, to make that happen. Because of the steep learning curves, like we mentioned with gardening, the average urbanite and suburbanite is going to be totally unprepared for what's going to happen if there is a grid down collapse, and they simply won't make it through the first year or two. Or worse yet, they will start to starve and then become predators upon those who are producing, and then resulting in even greater loss of life, because they'll be taking productive farmland out of production because the farmers simply won't feel safe to go outside their door. They won't hardly even feel safe to go out and get a load of firewood, much less tend to their fields and bring their crops to market. So that's the situation as I see it. And while there's a lot to be learned from the folks in the sustainable agriculture movement, and I fully embrace an exchange of information, I do warn people to not get sucked into that mindset. It feels good, but unfortunately, it's not realistic.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We've been speaking with James Wesley-Rawles tonight. His website is www.survivalblog.com. Jim, here's a little closing Confucian saying. We may learn wisdom in three ways. First, by reflection, which is noblest. Second, by imitation, which is easiest. And third, by experience, which is the bitterest. Your work is helping us to learn and prepare now so that we can look forward to overcoming future challenges and crises without too much harsh learning then. So, on behalf of Fox and all the members of the Time Monk Radio Forum, thank you, James. In the tradition of the pie-loving Time Monk Radio, may you and your family have many pies to come.
Thank you.